Test. Welcome to the 2017 Agnar Sandmo Lecture on Public Policy. I'm very happy to see so many attending, and I'm especially wishing to welcome Agnar Sandmo, who will follow the lecture on internet, web, and we all greet him and wish him well. He is recovering from a surgery and therefore could not join us today. But he's joining us on the internet. So, welcome, Agnar. The Agnar Sandmo Lecture on Public Policy and the Agnar Sandmo Junior Visiting Fellowship was inaugurated when Agnar was 70 years old in 2008. And it is in honoring his long contribution to NHH and his international standing. The lectures, this is number 10 actually, so we have an anniversary today. And we are very happy to have Professor Peter Diamond here for lecturing on this anniversary setting. And it has also been possible by contribution from the Center for Applied Research here at NHH. I will come back on the Junior Fellowship after the lecture. And now, to introduce today's lecturer, Professor Peter Diamond, I give the word to Rector Øystein Thøgersen, please.
As the rector of NHH, it's a pleasure to introduce Peter Diamond as the 2017 Sandmo Lecturer. Peter got his PhD from MIT in 1963. You have spent some time at Yale, Berkeley, other institutions, but for the overwhelming part of your career, you have been a professor of MIT. Peter received the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2010, together with Dale Mortensen and Christoph Pissarides. And the topic highlighted by the Nobel Committee was your big contributions to analysis of markets, and in particular labor markets, with search frictions. Analysis of labor markets are only one of several pillars in your incredible research agenda. Other areas include social security, pension design, and you'll talk about that today, tax theory, analysis of tax systems, capital markets, risk sharing, growth, debt, overlapping generations models. You started to publish in 1964. That was actually the year I was born. And you have continued ever since. And in addition to more than 150 regular articles in journals, you have published a lot of books as well. Your focus is often on very important applied topics in the intersection between public finance and macroeconomics. Thus, a key feature of Peter's research is the mix between deep theoretical contributions and highly topical policy pieces. Let me highlight one slightly personal issue. Earlier today, I browsed through parts of my own research, also in the intersection between macroeconomics and public finance. I was looking closely for a common theme in my various publications. And guess what? I found one. I found one in the typical section 2 of my articles. The typical section 2, knows everybody present, has the title, The Model. And then I found the first section, the first sentence in the second section, I found this common theme. I guess in 1/3 of my own research, this first sentence in the second section is more or less the same. And it is, this model extends the model of Diamond 1965. And as you might have guessed, this is your article on public debt and analyzed in the framework of an overlapping generations model. One of your highly influential articles, and at least it has been highly influential on my own research. I guess that you might touch this model today as well, explicitly or implicitly, because you will talk about pension design, and pensions are, or at least can be, transfers between generations, or maybe also transfers along or over the lifetime of each individual. I look personally very much forward to listen to you, and I'm convinced that I share this with everyone present. The floor is yours, please.
I'm very glad to be here. The first time I came to Bergen was 1967 when you were 3 years old. I remember, but you don't. I've known and admired Agnar and Agnar's work for a very long time. So I'm glad to have the opportunity to honor him, and I wish him a rapid and full recovery. Before going into some pension discussion, I don't know anything beyond a very superficial understanding about Norway's various parts of its pension system, so I won't say anything directly about the Norwegian system, but I will present issues in some other countries with which I am much more familiar, and I've selected ones that struck me as potentially of interest in the Norwegian setting. But first I want to say a little bit about the field of public finance in which Agnar and I both grew up. The Theory of Public Finance by Richard Musgrave was the textbook I learned public finance from. It was very newly published at the time. In fact, we had mimeographed, you don't know what mimeograph means, but it's pages with purple writing on them. Mimeographed pages of the typos in the book, and that ran multiple pages, and fresh ones kept coming in because it was new. I don't know if Agnar had it as a textbook as well, but I know it must certainly be the case that he studied it. The picture of the book here is not my own copy, which was much too battered and torn to make a suitable photograph for here. The Musgrave book was built around the idea that the government has three separate obligations to address, and analyzed the role of government by imagining three separate budgets, one a branch for allocation issues, one for distribution issues, and one for stabilization issues. Stabilization has mostly disappeared from public finance, apart from a continued recognition of the great importance of built-in stabilizers for helping with business cycles, and beyond the standard ones in the pension area, obviously retirement pensions and disability pensions both play a large role. A well-designed pension system recognizes that different people will have different appropriate times for choosing retirement, that the system needs to be flexible, and when it is flexible, individuals who have a decrease in their earnings opportunities will naturally start thinking more favorably about the possibility of retirement, which previously they may have thought was better delayed. Similarly, there are workers who meet and know they meet the conditions for getting disability pensions. For example, in the U.S., being blind makes you eligible, but many blind people work when they have good opportunities because they prefer work to living off such a pension. But if the work opportunities should shrink, again, a rational response and one that's socially worthwhile is to take advantage of it. It is not to deny that business cycle also will create a greater incentive for people to try to get disability benefits, who from a social perspective, it would be better if they didn't get them, and it may even be a bit fraudulent, but that's just part of the story, and to my mind, not the dominant part of the story. So pursuing optimal tax, which looks at general equilibrium, looks at the entire economy, has an impact on how one thinks about different questions. I've chosen one as an example. If you're just thinking about a tax in isolation, you would recognize that there's a deadweight burden if you go to collect more revenue from the standard tax that isn't a lump sum tax. And if you're financing a government expenditure with the revenue coming from a distorting tax, a standard statement you will find all over the place is that there's a positive marginal cost of taxation, and that should be factored in when considering the level of spending that you want to do, reflected in the marginal cost of the spending. However, when you look at general equilibrium, you need to ask about the structure of taxes and why it has the shape that it does. And an example is if you have an optimal income tax, which has been balancing distribution concerns along with revenue needs and efficiency concerns, then the marginal costs are being balanced against each other. And indeed, because you could take the revenue from people who have a zero marginal tax rate, the very bottom and the very top, there isn't a deadweight burden that counts for level of spending. So if the reason you have taxes is income distribution and you want to pay attention to it, you can't just look at inefficiency without also looking at income distribution. They need to be done together. Now, an example of a prominent paper in the literature, I thumbed through Agnar's CV, many of which I was familiar with, looking for one that was closest to what I was talking about today. And it's this paper, which he wrote with the late Tony Atkinson. It set up a model of overlapping generations, oddly enough. And but in each generation, there was a representative agent. And so the focus was on the taxation of savings and how that affected efficiency and how that affected intergeneration income distribution. And in the paper, they wrote this statement, the focus of which I just draw your attention to the bottom. The issues involved, the intertemporal issues, can be discussed in greater depth, but the cost is that some important matters have to be left out. I picked this because, as in all of Agnar's writings, the methodology is so sound and the presentation is so sound but I realized I didn't quite agree with his wording. And the wording here I disagree with is cost. And here I cite Alfred Marshall, another obviously very distinguished economist. And he points out the need to do exactly what Tony and Agnar did, which is break the problem down into separate pieces. And he doesn't view what you're leaving out as a cost. He views that as a necessary part of getting a deeper understanding. And obviously the methodology Agnar was following was recognizing precisely that, but being modest, no, not surprisingly, about saying what he was trying to accomplish. So let me now turn to pensions. Primary objective is what you're doing for the elderly. I have a pension. Let me say I'm a big fan of pensions. And there are three items that normally get listed. Consumption smoothing means improving the way people give up some consumption when younger in order to have more consumption when older. I phrase it in that mealy-mouthed kind of way because policy, first of all, this is a policy aimed at the entire population. And secondly, it's one that can't succeed for everyone. There are no realistic policies that give us Pareto improvements that make everyone better off. One is inevitably trading off what are the good things being accomplished and what are some of the costs being inflicted because we can't design it ideally for everybody. And secondly, insurance in old age, and insurance here, it really should say lower income rather than low. We have the built-in stabilizers I've already listed also help to give people insurance along their lifetime earnings trajectory. And a pension system is something that adds to that in terms of lifetime insurance provision. And third, because the elderly are not as much a part of the labor market as younger people, it's almost universal to have more generous poverty relief for the elderly than younger people, and the pension system is part of the design of that. So we recognize these different things. Now, pension design is difficult. It wouldn't be fun to work on if that wasn't true. And where do the difficulties come from? Well, diversities in the population is a big part of it. And so you're designing a system which, of course, has limited complexity and ought to have limited complexity so people can understand what's going on, and particularly in a democratic setting. And there's a lot of diversity in the population. The part of diversity that's been getting a great deal of recent attention is gender issues, and the fact that labor experiences of men and women are different, life expectancies are different, and then what do you do about this in your pension system? I'm not going to be talking about that today, except a little bit I'll bring in. Then there are economic and demographic risks to the system as a whole, so it's not just providing insurance in the standard model of a risk-neutral provision of diversifiable risks, but rather it's risk sharing of sizable aggregate risks. Pension is an area where costs are visible and important. Costs are visible and important in taxes generally, and addressing tax evasion is part of it, a field that Agnar has been a major pioneer in. But they're very visible in the pension area. I'll say a little bit about that. And, of course, a pension system is not something you set up and it runs itself and you're done. A pension system relies on the competence of the government in setting it up, in running it, and in how it evolves over time. And so different countries will go in different directions, in part out of competence, in part out of the political process. So pensions are part of public finance, but they're not part of the standard modeled assumptions in optimal taxation. The standard optimal tax is a competitive model in which you have asymmetric information and limited policy tools. In pensions, we start with the widespread observation that left to their own devices, significant fractions of the population will do inadequate saving for their own retirement. And while behavioral economics is digging into the logic of that, the fact of that is fundamentally unopposable. There are heated academic debates, that's what academic debates get to, over exactly what fraction, for example, in the US are inadequately saving. And some people say it's 50%, and some people say it's 30%. I don't know what the right number is, but it doesn't really matter because you need a system to help such a large fraction of the population what it is. But so if that were the only issue, you could just mandate that everybody put money aside for their later consumption and let them sort it out by themselves. But that's not the only obligation. What strongly appears and colors it is, first of all, a large fraction of the public has inadequate financial understanding to do well in both the accumulation process and the issue of taking your accumulation once you retire and spreading it out over the rest of your life. The starkest claim about that I've seen was from Arthur Levitt, at the time the head of the Securities and Exchange Commission in the US, when President Bush was proposing to have an individual account pension system in the US and everyone would be choosing stocks and bonds. Levitt said we would have to have a vast increase in the resources for regulating this industry because, for example, according to surveys, half the American public doesn't understand the difference between a stock and a bond. That makes it very hard to understand the risk-return trade-off and to optimize. And what do financial firms do? Well, they're firms. They react to the nature of their potential customers and design things to make money. Sometimes you make money by giving people exactly what they need. Sometimes there are other ways to make a bit more money. And the annuity market itself is inherently complex because of variations in life expectancy that include asymmetric information. So here, a simple example of financial literacy. This is a survey in the US. 2-period compound interest, and only a tiny fraction got it right when asked this rather straightforward question. So how does the market respond? I'm showing you some old data because it has the virtue that it's all about S&P 500 funds. So they're all trying to do exactly the same thing, follow the index, the S&P 500 index. And by and large, they all do it rather well, so they're very close to each other. And the significant difference across these funds is just the fees they charge. And two things should stand out to you from this figure. One is the financial intermediaries offer institutions much better deals than they offer individuals for good reasons. That there may be a lot less administrative cost involved because it's being borne elsewhere, but also for not so good reasons, which is taking advantage of market power, which is differential across different potential demanders. The other thing you see is both institutionally and individually, there is a huge spread in the prices at which the same product is being sold. And this is not because the milk you buy at the corner grocery is more convenient than going to the lower priced milk at the supermarket. This is all stuff you're buying. It's part of a reflection of the level of financial literacy. So since then, that picture, the numbers would look very different now, but the shape of the picture, as I've been citing, would be pretty much the same, because with the growth of index funds, there's been a big drop, annual drop, in mutual fund fees, both stocks and bonds in the U.S., steady trend down. But what remains the case, shown here for mixed funds, is a considerable variation in fees for related funds, funds in the same general type. And the second thing that stands out is if you look at a simple average of the different funds that exist, and you look at an asset-weighted average, that is the stuff weighted by how much people invest in them, you get very different answers. So the income distribution implications of turning people loose in the market as opposed to organizing the market, recognizing their financial limitations, can be very large. How important is this? Well, when President Bush was pushing these individual account plan, I remember hearing one advocate of it saying, so there's a 1% charge for these individual accounts. 1% is a small number. That's not a big number. And that led me to do a calculation which says the U.S. pension system is designed around your having a 40-year career from 21 to 62, which was the early benefit age. And if you collect 1% a year and compare what you've got for a different growth rate of making contributions, given real interest rate, how much less do you have at the end at that 1% than if there were no fees at all? And there is roughly a 20-to-1 ratio. Why 20-to-1? Because in a 40-year career, your average dollar gets taxed 20 times. Not quite right, so it's not precise. But as you can see, that's the kind of answer you get. So this is a big deal because if you can give everybody 10% larger pensions by holding down costs, and particularly when a lot of those costs are advertising and the like, there's a large social gain potential there. So let me steam ahead. Analysis of what firms say makes it clear that we're seeing obscurity in presentations, and a search theory shows obscurity is indeed a standard package. We got lots of different pension plans. When thinking about a country, you really want to think about the pension system. You can't think of a single plan relative to all the issues I raised. So let me now move in to some history of different countries. Chile in 1981 initiated the individual account national system. They did it in a very highly regulated way, and they discovered to their shock that they couldn't just rely on competition. What happened in the early days in Chile were sales personnel, attractive young women in short skirts, went door to door getting people to transfer their money to the particular firm they were working for. And fees were high and competition on fees wasn't happening. So they went through elaborate regulation. It took a long time till they added a solidarity part to address income distribution. They had a well-run plan once they got the kinks out, but they didn't have a well-run system until the administration of Michelle Bachelet that put that in place. But it looked so good, and the World Bank touted it as being so good, that a lot of countries followed it. And Chile made it look easy. It was in fact hard, and a number of countries have retreated from what they did. So what happened in Chile, right now Chile is again engaged in a debate on its pension system, and it had a commission of both Chileans and international scholars. I was not part of it. who came in and did a lot of surveys of the public. The public is very angry at the system. And there are two reasons the public is angry. One reason is it was done by a brutal military dictatorship, and they felt it lacked democratic standing. But the second is, compared to what they were told when it was set up, their experience was awful. And the reason for that is not that the interest rates turned out to be terribly different from expected, or life expectancy, but because the Chilean economy, like all the rest of Latin America, has a large informal sector where people don't make contributions. And if you make contributions half the time, your replacement rate's going to be terrible. And if you're designing a system for the whole population, and you design something that works well for the well-paid in the formal sector, but not for anyone else, you don't have a good system. In Australia, they put in place a mandatory system and let the employers organize it. And what they found was one of their problems is people ended up with multiple accounts. And hitting retirement, you may not remember where all of them are. So you try to go back to your previous employers, but some of them are out of business. They're gone. There are no records. So the issue of lost accounts gets a lot of newspaper coverage in Australia. And there's a sizable cost because a lot of the cost in accounts is a fixed cost per account, record-keeping communication. So Australia is in the midst of revision. Let me turn to Sweden. There's the heart of the system. I want to focus on the premium pension, which is this kind of individual account. In Sweden, they set this up in the mid-90s. All the political parties, except one on the left and one on the right, were part of the commission that did it. They decided to divide up the existing payroll tax charges in that way. The income pension, a notional defined contribution, is a particular hybrid form of defined benefit. The left got to design that. And the right got to design the individual accounts, which are very popular with the right. And so what did they do? Well, the ideology was choice is good. So they said any mutual fund that's active in the Swedish market and meets certain conditions can be part of the offers we give people. So they have 843 different mutual funds, and people are supposed to choose up to 5 of them and move their money around as they want among them. But obviously, some people won't make a choice, even though the government pressed hard to make people think they were supposed to. And so you need to set up a default. And what they did for a default was set up a government agency to do it, which has one equity fund, one fixed income fund, and you can have a little bit of choice, and a life cycle between them. I was in Sweden as this was coming out, and I was interested that at the time, the only way you would end up in the default is if you didn't mail in the form, or you mailed it in without filling it in. And yet I bumped into sophisticated academic economists who were not mailing in the form because they knew the default looked like a much better deal. And after a few years, the public, learning that the default was such a good deal, put political pressure, and despite the unhappiness of the financial industry, told people that yes, you could move your money to the default, you could choose it now. And so what's been happening is the default has become a big deal. Even with the instructions you were supposed to choose, roughly a third initially didn't. What's been happening since then is a little over 99% of new entrants are going into the default. And why does it look so good? Well, first of all, Sweden does something which is worth thinking about whenever you have a system which has mandates and uses either employers or the financial industry directly. In Sweden, the government collects all the money, economies of scope, it's collecting other taxes as well, and keeps the records. so you don't have lost accounts. And then they charge all of the funds the same, including the default, which is 7 basis points. Because they are doing this, they require the mutual funds coming in to give them a rebate on their usual fee. How much? 49 basis points. Huge cost savings by having the government not rely on the market. And the average fees net of this is 23 basis points. What do you get in the default? Well, if you go for the fixed equity fund, 14 basis points, fixed income 5. I'd be in the default. And right now, 45% of pension savers are in the default, and no doubt that's trending up. So accumulation is complex. There's scope for doing it badly or better. Financial industry lobbies hard for things that are profitable. There's not a whole lot of counterweight of some other industry. A lot of the fights over tax cuts involve multiple industries. But it's easy. We understand accumulation. What do you do for benefit structures is much more complicated. I'm running low on time, so let me just say in Sweden, they offer 2 different annuities. You can choose between them. And it's mandatory. You must annuitize. It's only a part of the system. You don't want to force everybody to annuitize everything. But what's interesting here is in the income pension designed by the left, there is not a survivor benefit. There's a transition survivor benefit, but there's not a permanent survivor benefit. The balances of the deceased go to their entire birth cohort. The premium pension done by the right, you can buy a 2-earner a joint life annuity. You can actually transfer your funds to your spouse. And this tension between encouraging women to work, which is the explicitly stated goal of the income pension design, and allowing families to work out what they want to do, is one of the many tensions that are out there. And I gather from my little bit of reading in English that Norway is still wrestling with the annuity question. And it's a tough one to wrestle with. Annuities are harder to follow, so in the UK, they found that a large part of people just bought the annuity from the firm that handled their accumulation, and most of them would have done better if they went elsewhere. Financial literacy again. Chile developed a complex system to help people choose better. I'm speeding up because I'm already out of time. So what to do with the adjustment of benefits and payment? Well, a bunch of different things are done in different countries. I don't know that we have a clear answer. I know price change alone is a mistake. That's what the U.S. does. But that would be another talk in another hour. And I finally want to mention Canada. Canada has a partially funded defined benefit system. They have what's basically a sovereign wealth fund, but it's 100% dedicated to the pension system and is run by an independent agency, and it's almost impossible for the government to take that money back for any other use. And the target is that the investment returns will cover 20 to 25% of the cost of the system, and the rest is pay as you go. But they do evaluations, and if the evaluation says they've got a problem, even without any politicians have a chance to do something about it, and if they don't, things can happen to keep the system sustainable. I offer Canada as a very interesting example to think about. You want to know more about this? A dozen years ago, Nick Barr and I served on a panel advising the Chinese government, which with unbelievable stupidity and great encouragement from the World Bank went to an individual account system. It never actually got off the ground, and to the extent they collected taxes, it led to the expression of empty accounts because the money wasn't really there. Nick Barr and I were on that panel. We had been asked to write things to help improve the general level of discussion in China. We did. The Chinese didn't use it because we had the good news, bad news. We were meeting with the Prime Minister, Wen Jiabao, and his ministers. But that meant the report could only be 30 pages because you can't give them a longer report than that. And the focus was on the policy knot. So we took the material and we wrote it as a book. And in various countries where they were having heated pension debates, members of the pension academic community translated the book. And this, from the preface, I think it's obviously a point that Norway is well aware of, but I think it's a suitable statement for a pension. So we have 5 minutes left for questions, which I think was my target. I can speak very fast when I have to. So, comment or question from anyone? If not, I'll run back through all the slides again.
China's very different systems and plans as they exist now. Is there a trend that countries copy each other and come to similar?
Several things. First of all, the extent of understanding of good features and bad features has evolved enormously since the early days of pensions. The second thing, in many countries, when they were setting it up, they were imitating the corporate plans that were viewed as the good ones at the time, but those again were, by modern standards, badly designed. So we're seeing two things happening. One is people are aware of real issues. I mean, sufficiently aware it gets into the political process, even in the U.S. Secondly, obviously everyone's aware we have major aging going on. And with major aging going on, many systems would not financially sustainable. So the issue of having to address that has led to lots of changes, and those are then incorporating many of the insights. And obviously the financial crisis, for a system that held a lot of assets, unlike there is no pure idealized pay-as-you-go, but the U.S. system only holds government bonds by law, so the financial crisis had an impact because unemployment meant a little bit less contributions. The financial crisis led to learning that there were huge risks that people hadn't been aware of. The most interesting place the debate of responding to that is happening is in the Netherlands, because they had industry-organized systems. If an industry wanted a system, it became mandated for the whole industry. And in there, they thought they had a defined benefit system, but it turned out there was a lot of fine print when the crisis got bad enough, and the workers didn't have what they thought they had, and businesses realized there was a bigger risk than they thought they had, and the system has been ongoing evolution, and at the same time, heated debates and a lot of interesting research on how to design to address the diversity issue within a system, trying to share the risks appropriately. Now, there is, as I showed in Chile, imitation going on, and I could have shown something on the imitation of Sweden in notional defined contributions, but that wouldn't be news in Norway. The only news might have been how long the list of countries going that way is. But there isn't a what I would think of as a trend toward a single design, because history is different, political shape is different, the needs of countries are different. So one of the appeals of the notional defined contribution, I don't know if it was the case in the Norwegian discussion, but it certainly was in the Swedish, was this will have some of the properties of defined contribution, and so that gave cover for what was actually reducing initial benefits when your life expectancy is longer, the way a defined contribution does automatically. In Germany, I was told to say it was like defined contribution would be the kiss of death to a proposal. So they needed a different way of doing the same thing to get sustainability, namely building in a demographic factor affecting the level of benefits. So yes, there is a lot of imitation. In this realm, I find it's very helpful to not just lay out the analytical case for doing something, but also to say, and it works here, and that doesn't work there. And actually, bad examples are usually more instructive in the political process than good examples. There are too many good examples, and you can't say this one's better than that, but that's bad. That has a direct implication for politics. So there's some convergence, but it's not going to one place.
So you mentioned that some differences that could lead countries to have different optimal pension systems. But one difference you didn't mention was how healthcare is organized. Especially in light of the debate in the US about how to organize healthcare, can you say a bit about how that interacts with that question of how to organize pension?
Yes. This goes back to the issue of whether you want to have everything annuitized. If you do, then if you want a cushion, a precautionary cushion of wealth, you have to build it up outside the system. And sometimes, the U.S. is an example, there are subsidized long-run savings opportunities, so you could do some of that. But how badly do you need precautionary savings once you're older? Well, that depends enormously on the nature of the health system and the long-term care. I mean, those are two places where you can get very large expenditures if the insurance doesn't cover it. For the elderly, the U.S. has Medicare, which does a pretty good job for the elderly, not perfect, but pretty good. It was designed to match the best corporate designs in the 60s when it was created, and hasn't evolved a whole lot since then, other than adding coverage for drugs, which didn't exist in the original because drugs weren't a big deal in the 60s. On the other hand, when it comes to long-term care, being in a nursing home for a few years, say, the U.S. only has a program for poor people, which has the unfortunate effect that it says, if this is something you can't afford on your own, you might as well run through your money because there's a wealth test as well as an income test. And there's a fair bit of that happening. So you've pointed to precisely one of the things that comes when you think more. It's one thing to think about the pension system, as I've emphasized, but you've got to think even more broadly than that, and you're exactly right. Okay.
Yes, please. One thing you have not said too much about is about intergenerational redistribution. So we were talking about stabilizing policy of pensions, but if you only have individual pension accounts, then you still probably some people retired in 2008 and lost all their retirement wealth right away. Do you have any kind of idea of building in intergenerational transfers?
There are two different dimensions in the literature addressing these intertemporal elements. One, and you're citing the financial crisis, addresses that, is to the extent that you're using the accumulation of financial assets as part of your system, then insofar as you can spread risk wider than just the owners at a point in time, which is, of course, exactly what you can do in a defined benefit system, then you can clearly do better. And there's a large literature out there, if you know the stochastic parameters, say, of the stock market, then you can design an optimal risk sharing across generations. And doing that, you will hold more stocks and less bonds because you're less risk averse in aggregate. And so you'll do better because you're less risk averse. You've moved the risk to a place where it's less costly. So there's one strand of literature exploring that. The other strand is looking much more at the distributional element, because when you set up a pay-as-you-go system to begin with, you're giving the early generations much more than could be financed by their own contributions. And that means either that you're taking money out of general revenues, which again comes from particular generations, but forget that because most systems are meant to be self-contained. Or you're saying later generations will get a lower return on their contributions than the market. The market rate may have gone up or down, and the earlier ones will get more. And how do we feel about that direction of redistribution? Well, particularly U.S. case, you're starting up in the 30s. You've got a lot of people who are in dire straits. It looks very attractive to do more for them. On the other hand, over time, you're saying now we're facing and politically, of course, that's attractive because future generations don't vote. Young people don't pay a whole lot of attention to pension issues. We know the lobby that's active on current benefits is the people who will be getting it. So you have to think about designing a system that can withstand that kind of lobbying pressure. And later on, there's the issue of, yes, we've inherited this cost. How do we want to spread it fairly across the remaining generations, which we're expecting perhaps some level of economic growth, of rising wages, but what's an appropriate way to spread it that way to meet whatever fairness criterion we have? And that's the other part of the literature. And Canada, for example, while it's set up in the 60s, a pay-as-you-go system that did a lot of redistribution to the early generations, it didn't want more of that to happen. So they put in place a rule that when you expanded the system in any way, that had to be break-even for the first generation subject to it, as well as being average covered for everybody. So it was directly addressing this incentive. And so they've done a recent expansion. Recent, I think it may have been in the 90s. That, to me, that looks very recent. They had special rules so that they had a phase-in. The benefits didn't grow right away to the new higher level. They were phased in to reflect the fact that they were financing it with an increase in contributions, and older people would only be doing that for a few years. So it got phased in that way. And so in both of these dimensions, there is a very interesting academic literature. The problems are sufficiently complex that so far it hasn't gotten very far in terms of crispness of policy recommendations of the kind where on accumulation, I say with great comfort, that's a bad system. This one could easily be improved, and I can name countries that I couldn't have done it worse. But I won't right now.
It's very clear that we should have given you much more time, so thank you for answering these questions. And I have a message from Agnar. So I would like to read to you, Peter, and to all of the audience. And it says, "Nice to see you, Peter. Great to follow your extremely clear and elegant lecture from my hospital bed, I felt I was almost there with you. I'll send you some comments later. Very good. Wish you a pleasant stay in Bergen. And he ends with greetings to everyone present. So. And then I should thank you very much for giving us this very, as Agnar said, clear and elegant and interesting lecture. We have a small gift for you. Well, not so small, but a gift.
Let me get untangled.
Of course, this is Bergen, close to where your hotel is, but with the normal weather and not the nice weather we have now. So, please, thank you very much. Now, as I announced, we also have the Agnar Sandmo Junior Visiting Fellowship, and the Junior Fellow this year is Andreas Fagereng, and he's with us today, so I have a small token and a diploma for him. He's currently researcher at Statistics Norway. His interest is household finance and labor economics. He has a PhD from the European University Institute in Florence, and also, which you can look up on his CV, he has a very impressive list of papers that is now being published in very, very good journals. So we are very happy that he accepted to be the 2017 Sandmo Junior Visiting Fellow. He will come, he's here today, but he will come back and give a lecture and have talks with people in the school and in the department. So may I congratulate you, Andreas, and please come to the floor so that I can. So we are very happy to have you here, and we are also very happy to have you back in some weeks. May I first give you the diploma?
Thank you very much.
And also for you, some rainy Bergen. And this ends the 2017 Sandmo Lecture on Public Policies. Thank you.